Right. So I have been with the Alliance for the last 4 years and I lead the governance team here. I've been a governance manager working with predominantly national governing bodies or smaller organizations, non sport organizations as well. And during my experience, I have worked very closely with boards, senior management, just to improve on governance, organizational matters, strategy, etc. So you name it, anything around governance I have been involved with. During my work here, I have been seconded to Sport England to work on the code, a code for sports governance. So I worked with Sport England for 6 months, trying to help them draft the content of the code, as well as project the code in itself, because it was a joint effort from UK Sport England. So that's a quick introduction from me. And we will be looking at a code for sport governance today, which sets out requirements for public organisations who would like to get funding from UK Sport or Sport England. But before we begin, quick housekeeping instructions from me. This webinar is recorded. You will receive a copy of the presentation and access to the webinar in an email later. The webinar will last between 45 minutes to an hour. Feel free to ask questions during the webinar using the chat pod, like some of you already have. I'll try and address the questions as soon as I can, but obviously, if I'm in between slides, then I will try and address it as soon as it's best for me to do so. So let's begin. We will look at the structure of the code today. We will review the three tiers and how it originated, how the three tiers originated. And we'll also look at how the boards can apply the code, especially for smaller organizations and organizations who are looking to get from funding from either organizations. We'll look at the impact of the code in the sector since 2 years since its publication as well. We'll finally look at a couple of case studies, obviously, just to understand how it has been applied in the sector and how the peers have applied the code to their boards. So, looking at the structure now, let's look at how it all began. Um, the the government's vision during a new strategy in 2015 was set out through Sporting Future. Through Sporting Future, the government tried to define a vision for what success looks like in the sports sector. And as part of that, DCMS have been instructed to publish a new code for the sports governance. Obviously, that will then passed on to the UK Sport and Sport England, tasked to publish a code by September 2016, equivalent of the Financial Reporting Council's UK Corporate Governance Code. The desire was to set and deliver gold standard with the highest benchmark in the sector. The aim was to allow higher standards of good governance from organizations requesting the largest public investments. Although the sector maintained good governance in the past through audit and assurances, this is all through the funded organizations, governance was not considered good enough until things went wrong. So if we look at the attitude in the sector, that's what it was for majority of the boards. The sector also lacked uniformity or a single set of governance requirements which were fit for purpose in this challenging environment. And that was some of the background reasons how this code has evolved and come into existence. The code was launched in November 2017. And just to recap, it went live in April 2017. So, any organization seeking public funding from 2017 had to apply and comply with all the requirements of the code from April 2017. Sport England and UK Sport jointly developed and implemented it. Unlike the other UK corporate governance codes in the country, which are voluntary, i.e., you comply or explain the failure to do so. This code was the first of its kind in the UK to include mandatory compliance. This means organizations had to comply and have agreed a governance action plan to be in place to comply before the funding is released to them. This has never happened in the past in the UK, even in other home nations such as Scotland or Wales or Ireland. So this was the first in England to implement such a mandatory code. The mandatory approach provides a lever to drive improvement, evidenced through some of the constitutional changes, and it also provided the push that was needed in the sector. The momentum was also created using this code as a leverage to improve governance standards within the sector. Again, UK code was not just created out of vacuum. Um, through the mandatory nature, obviously, both organisations, UK Sport England, worked with over 200 organisations to finalise what they call a robust set of requirements which are unique to the sector. Again, they tried to take a proportionate approach to deliver the tiered structure of the code to make it possible for smaller to the biggest of the organizations operating in the sector to allow to have a good level of governance standards. Although the implementation process is prescription process, what I call it, the guidelines in the code itself offer some common sense application. So we will look at what that looks like in the next few slides, but this is just to give an indication of what the code is all about and what that includes. And moving on, again, most of you will be familiar. The code has three main tiers, and there will be five. There are five main principles included in all these three tiers. The three tiers are applied to strengthen the market discipline, regardless of the size of your organization or how you and who you operate with within the sector. The first tier, tier one, is very basic level. Again, it is aimed to small organisations who receive funding less than £250,000, and it is aimed at sports clubs, non-sport organisations such as the GLA, etc., who are not sport organisations but do receive public funding and therefore have to comply with the code. Tier 2 is the middle structure where the funding region is between 250k up to 1 million. And some of the sport and non-sporting organizations who do not obviously fit in the tier 1 and who are not big enough to operate on an NGB level fit within this tier. Sport England also fund one-off sporting fundings, and they do provide one-off funding to some organizations, and therefore these organizations also fall within the tier 2 structure. The top level, the tier 3, is predominantly and also aimed at just the NGBs, and again, these are the sporting organizations operating in the sector, and the focus on driving the nation towards the golden standards in sports governance. Again, as you can just see, tier 3 is obviously aimed to drive the standards of governance within the sector. As I mentioned before, using these three tiers is how flexibility and proportionate approach is maintained throughout the code. The code has 58 mandatory governance requirements across the five principles. Seem quite daunting thing to just think about 58 mandatory requirements, doesn't it? But I promise it isn't as daunting as it is when we try and dwell through each of the five principles, because the requirements are very common, normal that any organization would apply for their boards. The new requirements that's been added to them is obviously the gender requirements, where 30% of female board members are required on any board, and obviously improving diversity, compliance, such as annual governance statements, etc. So these are the new things included, but the 58 mandatory governance requirements are not very new to the sector. The proportionate tiered approach, dependent on the level of funding and the nature of relationship with either of the organizations. They also make quite distinct distinguishing between sport and non-sporting organizations, obviously. So if you're not a sport organization, you do fall within the tier 1 or tier 2 of the structure, and therefore the implication and the compliance level of the governance requirements is low compared to tier 3 of organizations. Principle 1, the structure. It looks at having a clear picture and an appropriate governance structure. It looks at the board, the primacy of the board, and the composition if, to make sure if it is fit for the purpose. For example, although the governance code says 30% of female directors or male directors should be included on the board, there are some sport organizations who are predominantly female only led, and therefore the code obviously looks at the composition to see if the current composition is fit for purpose, and if it is, then obviously that works for the organization. Principle 2 is all about people. It looks at recruiting the right people with appropriate diversity, independence, skills, experience, and knowledge. And what the principle 2, the people, look at is a combination of all. It is not just having the whole set of skills. It is not just having experience within the sector. It is not just having the sports knowledge. It is a combination, a right combination of all of these, which the core thing, the code things, is a better mixture for the right people sit on the right boards. Principle 3 is about communication. So this is about transparency, this is about accountability and engaging effectively with stakeholders. Stakeholders mean the funders, your members, and your partners, whoever your organization stakeholders are. So that's principle 3, effectively having the clear communication and two-way communication within the stakeholder group. Principle 4 looks at the standards and conduct. This is all about integrity, regular evaluation, and continuous monitoring of the current standards and the codes of conduct that your organization currently has. This is all about improving the current standards. So if any organization is looking to seek new funding or looking to approach Sport England or UK Sport to kind of look at where they sit within the funding requirements, then then they will also be looked at what are the current standards and how the standards have improved in the recent past to make the organization and the standards fit for purpose in the environment they operate. Principle 5, the last one, is all about policies and procedures. Again, it is about how the sport complies with the relevant laws and regulations. Some sports may be deemed to be much more risk in terms of their stakeholder group, i.e., working with young children or working with vulnerable adults, for example. Therefore, the focus on the policies will be on such relevant laws and regulations that are fit for your needs. So that is what the policies and procedures in this principle would look at. Right. Moving on, let's look at the application of the code. And through this, I'm going to begin by reviewing what the benefits of compliance is. I have been reviewing governance standards and structures to some of smaller members of ours. As some of you know, the Sport and Recreation Alliance have a vast majority of membership in the sector. Some are very small, some are big institutions, but I do work with some of the small organizations. And recently, I have been working with one of the small organizations where they have come to me to help them improve their governance standards from tier 1 to tier 3. And the first question they asked me is that, how they can actually do all the compliance considering they are such a small organization and they do have a very small board. Therefore, they were worried that they couldn't actually get into all the compliance and the paperwork, etc. I will deal with that in the next slide, but I will try and look at what the benefits of compliance is for the benefit of this webinar. And we will move on to kind of, remove that association of compliance being a logistical nightmare for some of the boards at the later section. Again, the first benefit is very clear. It gives you access to public funding. And any organization is able to receive funding if they comply or agree to comply with the set of standards. Again, this is not used as a barrier to investment, but if willingness is there, both UK Sport and Sport England will offer support, and that's something that everybody should keep in mind. The benefit of compliance is that it provides a common framework within the sector, especially for groups of organizations like the NGBs and CSBs. There will then become a common framework in terms of language, consistent practices, measures, and benchmarking progress. So there are quite a few benefits for the sector itself having that common framework applied within a set of organizations. The new code, the benefits of the new code is to promote long-term sustainable success to any organization that applies. I have been working with a few organizations in the recent past, and I must admit, organizations tend to become much more independent and stronger and strategically much more obvious that they have been looking at the future and planning for the future ahead, where the funding may not be the same what it is now, and therefore one of the benefits of compliance is actually making the organizations fit for purpose. For me, I think this is the start of a journey which allows the sector to strive for better boards, well-run organizations, and mainly creates a network of peers within the sector. This is something that hasn't happened in the past. Moving on, like I said, complying with the code, again, daunting for some, but not very daunting in practice. There is consultation and guidance from funders. So both UK Sport and Sport England provide support with compliance. That support includes consultations, templates, signposting to relevant partners such as us, the Sport and Recreation Alliance. Contrary to some of the beliefs in the sector, UK Sport and Sport England do offer support and guidance to organisations who seek future funding as well. I must also note that this practice of offerings of guidance is quite unique to our sector and not something that is common in the corporate sector or anywhere in the Europe. So I think again it is quite a positive thing, that is happening through the code. Again, the compliance with the code should be viewed as a way to ensure accountability. I personally think anyone running the sport organizations, should look at this much more positively rather than as a tick box exercise to do, because this is something that's lacked in the past. The common framework, the consultation, the guidance, and all the set of support that's been given. Non-funded organisations, i.e. organisations who do not receive any funding from UK Sport or Sport England, do seem to believe that they have to be fully compliant before they can apply for funding. This is untrue. Once an organization is deemed that they are eligible for a set of funding, then UK Sport and Sport England do consider roadblocks to compliance before making the final decision of funding. So therefore, if you do think your organization has a good project, your organization is an NGB that is, doing all the right things that it does and is on the road to get funding, if you are not fully compliant, then do not worry, there is assistance that is provided by both organizations. Having said that, again, we at the Sport and Rec Alliance also happy to work with any small organizations to see how we can help them and reassure them with the compliance with the code, either tier 1 to tier 3. We have done and offered assurance in the past to some of our members. A lot about the compliance and how it is beneficial. Let's look at the practical application. When I say practical application, again, this is what Sport England and UK Sport will be looking at. The practical application of the compliance is pretty straightforward, really. What they will look at is assurance and assurance from the organizations who are applying the code. First things first, though, both UK Sport and Sport England have moved on from using the word audit, and now it's only assurance. As you can see, the attitude and nature of the funders is changing as well. This is moving on from having boards being audited for what they're doing correct and what they're not doing correctly, to an assurance process where the board is unable to comply with a set of requirements. Then there is a two-way dialogue that happens, and there are assurances that are being sought, and then a final deadline date of when the requirements will be met. So therefore, there is still flexibility and leeway from both the funders to organizations who are applying the code on different levels. What does compliance mean? Again, in practice, both organizations are seeking assurance on three main areas. First and foremost, the financial assurance. Again, this is key because organizations are seeking public funding, and therefore UK Sport and Sport England have to do the assurance on financial areas. The second area is governance, and rightly so, because that's where the code application will be monitored on. And lastly, the main area they would look at is culture. This is something new, and they have been speaking about it in the recent past. Again, this is not about the application of the hard core principles of governance. This is also looking at the culture and the behaviors within the code as well. The practical application, the assurance process allows for self-regulation. What this means is obviously the organizations applying the code will need to show assurances, self-assurances, through statements such as the annual governance statement, or a during their dialogue with their partners at UK Sport and Sport England. So there is also assurances being given from the organization. So therefore, you're self-regulating, and that's what both the UK Sport and UK Sport England are trying to get to. Some, again, in the past have not been very happy about how the audit and assurance process has worked, because that seemed to be much more of a tick box exercise. But again, UK Sport and Sport England have been assuring the sector that they are trying to move on from the existing ways of working, because again, let's face it, both organizations have limited resources, and therefore they need to prioritize them effectively. So the assurance process allows them to better manage time and resources. And the only assurance process, if your organization or any organization is jointly funded, then there is only one assurance process, and therefore they will avoid any duplication of work as well. Well, you might be wondering, what is assurance and how does this work in practice? So the assurance will look at risk-based, Therefore, if any organization is going through some various governance changes or board changes, and again, that's a risk-based approach they would take, and therefore an assurance for governance or finance will then be sought depending on what the organizational change is going through. Um, um, Proportionate means approach is taken as well for any of these three areas, wherein they will recognize the first stage of compliance is just looking at how organizations comply with the 58 requirements, but at the same time that will move away from the 58 requirement compliance to much more self-assessed element, and where their funded partners will be expected to take responsibility and ownership for their own governance, financial management of the investment they receive. This will be balanced again, the assessment through independent auditors, of course, and the new organization they have recruited, the BDA, who will then provide the assurance process to Sport England UK Sport. I think the practical application, when it comes down to what that really means, is that organizations should live and breathe the spirit of the code. And what they mean by the spirit of the code is to embed the code in the culture of the organization, to look at the board behaviors to ensure the spirit of the code is lived through and not just use it as a tick box exercise to continue receiving funding from year on, from either organizations. There are slight variations on how the assurance is sought from UK Sport and Sports England, rightly so, because Sport England funds much more organizations in the sector, not just the NGBs and sport organizations. So obviously assurance process will be about, relying on ongoing governance manager relationships, annual, thematic code compliance check-ins, and independent, audit reviews. But between these three, the assurance process will slightly differ from who your funder is, but save for these slight changes, the assurance areas will always remain the same. Your finances, your governance, and the culture is what the assurance you need to provide to these funders as well. That's the practical application of it. Again, quite straightforward, what you need to look at and what you need to provide. Moving on, again, the code has been implemented in the sector for the last 2 years. So let's have a look at the code impact and what the sector has, and how the sector has improved in the last 2 years, and how some of the boards have applied the code, and how it mattered to some of the boards as well. Um, as uh, as we can all imagine, with the code being applied to vast majority of organizations in the sector, not just sport, but non-sport organizations as well, there has been high levels of compliance and a common set of governance requirements across the sector. Since its launch, the code again has seen that there is a peer support and a peer network through the compliance. Organizations are talking to each other as to what and how they've applied the code, and seeking assurances from each other and how best they apply the code within the organization as well. Sector is moving towards self-regulation through governance statements, and this is quite similar to the corporate sector as well. So the FRC code expects all the organizations to publish an annual governance statement, allowing the organizations to describe how they've applied governance in their organizations throughout the year, and if some element of the governance code has not been applied, what the organizations have done in order to improve the areas. That is something that's will be quite common in the sector in the near future as well. We've talked about governance statements, and I think I would also like to talk a bit more about the international reputation for excellence of governance in the sector. and the organizational culture as well, against the backdrop of some negative stories on the international stage. The UK sports sector is actually viewed as the leading way and being at the forefront of good governance, either thinking or in its practice as well. I'll talk a bit more about this in the next few slides. Again, just moving on as well, let's look at the role of sporting organizations or organizations operating in the sector. Um, Again, what Sport England and UK Sport look at is for any organisation to be quite effectively self-assess their governance and their ways of working. This means an honest self reflection. This allows them to see in the mirror themselves and how they're operating. That is what they think, both Sport England and UK Sports think sporting organisations' role should be to begin with. They also believe there is a desire to continue, improve, and go beyond what is in the code. Example, promoting better governance throughout their county and regional structures. Let me give an example here of what else has been happening through the code. Some of the organizations that I work with or liaise with have started applying the code as it is to their counties and clubs as well. Some of the organizations, such as the FA, cycling and golf, introduced the governance code or a form or part of the governance code to their counties and clubs, and some of them has used the condition of funding for these counties to improve governance. What this is driving is the governance code in itself is not setting any standards just on the highest level of the sports sector, i.e., the NGBs or publicly funded organizations, but it is trying to drill through the grassroots and the counties and the sports clubs as well. So some of the bigger organizations are already looking at how they can deliver good governance through to their grassroots as well. Again, the role of sporting organizations is not just to be compliant on paper, but to ensure the living and breathing of the spirit of the code, and that is done through culture and behaviors within the organizations, particularly around the board. The board culture is what that that matters in the organizations. And again, there is a cross-sector working as well, which hasn't happened in the past. There is support for each other, i.e. sharing best practices. There's peer reviews happening through board evaluations. And again, one of the main requirements of the governance code is that organizations go through independent board evaluations every few years, which allows independent evaluation of the board and the ways of working for organizations. Again, that allows them to do peer reviews and to share best practices from what the evaluations brings out within the organizations every few years. So this is what the funders think the role of sporting organizations should be in order to self-evolve to reach to the golden standards of good governance in the sector. Let's look at what the impact of the code has been in the sector to date. To date, 58 national governing bodies of sport have been assessed, and over 34 of them had to make significant constitutional changes to achieve this compliance. Let me explain a little bit about what that means and what that meant for some of the organizations. There were some organizations in the sector who were operating with many levels of primacy, where the board did not have primacy, or the board had some primacy on matters, but the councils had primacy, and there were other, the member organizations who got involved as well. So there wasn't any uniformity, or the constitutions within the organizations did not lack any uniformity as well on how they operated. Again, this is due to the historical nature of how these organizations evolved, and rightly so. But I think what this code has done, or forced some of the organizations, is to make such significant changes to achieve compliance with the 58 requirements. And I'm pleased to note that nearly all of them have achieved full compliance as of last year. I do not have the raw data with me, but Sport England and UK Sport are quite ambitious with the code, and they do believe compliance levels have gone up since the last year as well. Like I introduced earlier, Sport England also funds other organisations in operating in the sector. So again, they have so far assessed 500 plus organisations against Tier 1, and that's again looking at smaller clubs, smaller organisations, non-sport organisations who've been assessed against Tier 1 and received funding to Tier 1. Um, Over 180 organizations at tier 2 and 3 have been assessed to date with code compliance. And recently, UK Sport has launched the Aspiration Fund in 2018. What that means is an additional 3 million funding pot from DCMS was received to support NGBs who have a potential to qualify athletes to Tokyo. Again, new work has been included, new elements have been included to ensure more and more organizations, or governance needs are met through additional funding as well. um, some of you may already know this, but once any organisation receives funding from UK Sport or Sports England, as part of their support and guidance, the organisations also provide one-off governance fund to improve board governance. Say, for example, any of the organisations will need recruitment for a new director, an independent director, or a chairman, for example. There is always guidance and assurance through governance fund, from both these organizations as well. So again, there is a lot of scope and chance for new organizations to access additional funding from the organizations to improve governance and the ways of working as well. You might be wondering what the future looks like for the code. I don't think the answer lies with even more rules within the governance code the way we see it. The focus should be on behavior, and will be on behavior. As you can see, the focus is shifting from hard governance to much more softer governance, such as culture and behaviors. And I think the focus will be on building capabilities to make these reforms much more meaningful in the near future as well. The times are challenging for the sector, and therefore both UK Sport and Sport England are very mindful of what the changes are required within organisations to be sustainable, to be fit for the future as well. So for me, personally, I think the future of the code will look like very much less on compliance and ticking the boxes of the 58 requirements, but will move towards self-assurance, self-governance, and looking at a board which is functioning at its highest level and building capabilities within the board sector, looking at diversity, or looking at skills, or looking at young members on boards. That's what the future of the code focus will be looking at in the future. So this is all about the code, the impact, and how it can be practically applied for organizations who already receive funding or who are looking to receive funding from UK Sport. And we've also talked about what the assurance is and what the support looks like as well. As part of that, before we move on to the case studies, I would also like to kind of assure that the Sport and Recreation Alliance works very closely with Sport England and to some extent with UK Sports as well. So we are here to kind of support organizations to reach that good level of maintaining governance within the sector. So again, please feel free to contact us if you do have any questions on what we have discussed today. Moving on, I have compiled two case studies here today. One is looking at a very small organizations and organization and how it evolved to actually become an Olympic sport. And I will also be looking at one of the biggest national governing bodies in the UK and one of the oldest national governing bodies in the UK, and how they applied the code as well. So let's quickly look at the case studies today. First case study is looking at Skateboard England. Some of you may be familiar with it, or some of you may not. Skateboard England formed in 2015 and as a not-for-profit organisation. Since its formation, again, it worked with skateboarders and also within the, with experts in the sector to work towards the recognition process and working closely with Sport England. I have worked with them in the past, because their focus ever since they've formed was to implement good governance principles and adopting the principles of good governance um, of, of the sport and recreations governance principles in the sector. Again, they worked in conjunction with the Alliance and the Sport England to improve their current structure, policies, and governance, and they have continually strived to improve the ways of working. Currently, I'm pleased to say they are on tier 1 and they're tier 1 compliant, but they are working to move towards tier 3 compliant. They're currently being recognized as an Olympic sport, which obviously is very good news for such a small organization. And they're looking for Tokyo funding for 2020 as well. Again, that puts a lot of focus and pressure for a small organization in order to maintain that level. The Skateboard England have recently gone ahead and recruited few independent and few directors to come onto their board to make sure that they have relevant set of skills and expertise to go through the Olympic cycle for Tokyo 2020 as well. So again, very good progress, if you ask me, for such a small organizations to come through, and obviously such a great story to spread around, and what good case study to look at as well. Again, very positive for Skateboard. We'll move on to look at the FA. Most of you know the FA, obviously no introductions needed, but some of you may not know is the FA had one of the most complex constitutional and governance structure in the UK. Well, I say in the UK, in the sports sector, obviously. So for them, as you may know, in the past, making any amends to their current board or current structure was next to impossible because of the way their voting structure involved the council, and majority of the council tend to be quite traditional and therefore refuse to vote for any modern reforms. Having gone through all this and having not achieved any governance reforms, the FA board actually saw the code as a leverage to make such changes happen. Again, the first governance reforms that the FA put through to the board, FA boards put through to the council, was rejected by the council, saying this is not how the constitution has been evolved for the FA, and therefore they will reject any reforms. So the FA was actually unable to comply with any of or most of the tier 3 requirements of the code, and went to a point where Sport England said they will withdraw the funding from the FA if they will not comply or provide assurances that they will comply with the 58 requirements within the code. Again, you might wonder, the FA has a lot of money. Why would the small funding from the Sport England matter? It did matter because any of the funding that they received from Sport England went straight through to the grassroots, and therefore it was very important for the FA to receive that public funding and pass it on to the grassroots. But at the same time, I guess the chairs, ministers, and the public pressures paved way to make the reforms within the board and to their council structure as well. When I say council structure, the FA had about 122 council members sitting on their councils. None of them ever had any term limits, so it was a job for life. Until you die, you will never get out of the council. The council also included Oxford and Cambridge representatives who had nothing to do with the FA. None of the other universities in the country represented the FA council, obviously. So there was some, discrepancy as to why just the two universities represented. So therefore, as you can see, the council structure was not fit for the purpose. The FA's shape and the structure and the grassroots FA, how it is evolving, it does not really, transpire to what the council was there to do. Anywho, good news is that all of this pressure and the leverage from the funders paved way, and the FA finally agreed to implement all of the 58 requirements, and that needed significant changes to their articles, to their board structure, to their council structure, including giving term limits to council members, and therefore there will be new council members that will be elected every few years from now on, and not just the board. The council has also now agreed that there will be much more diversity around the council. It will not just be the two big universities in the country that will represent, but there will be a representation of other university as well. So as you can imagine, the code itself has paved way to make such good reforms, to make an organization, a historic organization such as the FA, to become modern and fit for purpose for what it stands for currently. They have not reached all of the requirements. Obviously, as you can see, the current board structure of the FA, they are yet to meet the 30% gender requirement, what the code has to say. But considering the fight, what they have put up with in the last 2 years, and considering the amount of governance changes that they've, made through significant changes they made through, I think they've made very good progress, and I think the FA are looking forward to improving much more governance, not just through gender representation, but through to their grassroots as well. I work very closely with the company secretary of the FA, so I can quite confidently say they are using the structure of the code to use that to the county FAs as well as part of the governance improvement, and the FA are using the funding as a leverage. Therefore, if the county FAs will need funding from the FA, they will have to show they meet all the requirements of the governance code, or the relevant requirements of the governance code, in order to get funding from the FA. So therefore, the FA are doing quite a lot of good things through the code to drive change and improvement through the county FAs as well. So again, good news for all over, good news for the rest of the sport, good news for grassroots as well. That's the second case study, and that takes us to the end of the webinar. This is where you can ask me questions through the chat pod. Happy to take any questions that you may have at this stage, or you can feel free to kind of connect with me after the webinar and ask me questions at a later date as well. Happy to do that. Let me just check if there are any questions. I'm just waiting for some of the participants to type in the questions. So please bear with me. If there are any, I will take the questions in the next few minutes. If not, we will then conclude the webinar. I have had one question so far. The question was that if small organizations I've worked with, how they could deal with everything and how many board members did they have. Quite frankly, small organization board size tends to be between 6 and 8. And not surprisingly, some of the smaller board members smaller boards, um, tend to have up to 10 members, I would say, and that's because historically they have not changed the shape or size of the organizations. Um, when I was talking about organizations implementing, and I must stress here that um, the way I work with small organizations is to kind of look at what their current situation and what they're currently working on, and based on that, I help them improve governance in chunks. Therefore, it is feasible for them to look at board governance for once, for example, moving on to organizational structure later, for example, or then looking at strategy at the next level, for example. And when we look at these chunks, it makes it much more easier for smaller boards to focus on what really matters to them in the immediate future. Therefore, one of the boards that I've been working with in the past, they looked at their current board structure, uh, and they realized they needed to do a board skills audit and a board evaluation, which then again came out with a few governance actions that the board had to work on before they moved on to looking at the organizational structure or their strategy for the next 3 to 4 years. So again, it is looking at bite-sized chunks of improvements within the organization, and what that looks like is completely individual to each organization. So it is quite unique, and it is very doable depending on what the organization's immediate focus is. I hope that answers your question. Another question is about the guidance from UK Sport that's been being published. I do not think there is any information yet publicly, but I do know both UK Sport and Sport England have produced some guidance, and they have been giving that guidance and support to the organizations they currently fund. I do not believe there is anything public at the moment, but again, happy if there is any particular guidance you may need, feel free to drop me a line and see what I can do in terms of help and support with that as well. Guidance on annual governance statement. Yes, we do have at the Alliance. We do have some guidance in terms of what the annual governance statement should look like, and board recruitment. Again, what I provide support on board recruitment is to look at the best practices and what is expected of the code. Uh, it is again an individual judgment, an individual response to a particular board size and what the board requires. um I will check with UK Sport and see if there is anything that they could pass on to me that I can again spread the word and send out any information available to all of you who've attended. Leave that with me as an action, and I will try and get back to you on this. But at the same time, if you need immediate guidance in terms of annual governance statement, then we at the Alliance are happy to provide to you. So please do contact me or my colleague Michelle at a later date. Brilliant. That concludes the questions I've received. Thank you everybody for joining me today. Hope this was helpful. Again, please feel free to contact me if you do have any more questions. I'll be more than happy to assist you. Have a good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. Bye for now.